we've seen so far, although I've stopped along the way to talk about a lot of detail with regard to certain pieces, that Machiavelli's being very systematic in the way he lays out kinds of government. There are republics and there are principalities. Not going to talk about republics. There are hereditary principalities. Not going to talk much about them. And there are new principalities. Okay, now we've done another subdivision. There are new principalities that are conquered through fortune. That's what we looked at last time. Now we turn to there are new principalities that are conquered through wickedness. And the example that Machiavelli gives is, again, one of those that his audience would know better than we do unless we're really geared up to classical history, a guy named Agathocles of Syracuse. Perhaps also to dramatize this, and perhaps recognizing that some of his audience might not know Agathocles real well, Machiavelli also gives a modern example from one of these minor states in Italy, a guy named Oliverotto of Fermo. Again, I'm not going to go into detail about these guys. You can read a little bit of their background in the Prince and also in translations like the one I am using. There are fairly detailed sort of mini biographies, even of the minor characters of the Prince, that are very useful. But here is the question. How do you understand? How do you deal with? How do you explain? How do you analyze? Do you praise or do you blame those who conquered territories through wickedness? Machiavelli says, well, it's possible to attain power by just killing lots of folks. That's one way to do it. And that's what these guys did. However, Machiavelli says you acquire power, but not glory, when you kill a number of citizens. Now, one of the questions we might ask Machiavelli is, well, how important is glory as opposed to power? In other words, how do we deal with the fact that some of these guys who come in and kill a lot of people end up being successful? Again, they have an idea of a society they want to create, and they come in with knives a-flying, and they are able to take over and create that. Well, Machiavelli deals with this in one of the most famous passages in The Prince. And I actually want to read this to you, and then we can talk about it a little bit. Many others, he says, employing cruel means, were unable to hold on to their state even in peaceful times, not to speak of the uncertain times of war. I believe this depends on whether cruelty be badly or well used. Those cruelties are well used, if it is permitted to speak well of evil, that are carried out in a single stroke, done out of necessity to protect oneself, and then are not continued, but are instead converted into the greatest possible benefits for the subjects. Those cruelties are badly used that, although few at the outset, increase with the passing of time instead of disappearing. Those who follow the first method can remedy their standing both with God and with men, as Agathocles did. The others cannot possibly maintain their positions. Well, this is a language that's very disturbing to a lot of people. Cruelty well used. We want to put cruelty and well used in separate categories and make them exclusive of one another. But Machiavelli says cruelties can be well or ill used. Again, the very language shocks us, and Machiavelli knows it shocks us. This is nonsense to Aristotle. This is nonsense to Cicero, these two great venerated classical authors, these two great thinkers whose political ideas have so penetrated the culture of Western Europe, even more so during the Renaissance. And now Machiavelli talks about well-used cruelty. It reminds us that this is a different book and a different kind of book in some way that's ever been written in the West. Again, even though it follows the form of other mirrors of princes, we need to appreciate how staggeringly different this is. And you can imagine today, as well as in Machiavelli's own day, how people respond to phrases like that. Well-used cruelty. Hey, you just did something cruel. Well done in this case, or badly done. Either way. And today, we find things such as a book entitled Machiavelli's Virtue, which argues for a kind of need to understand Machiavelli as a political thinker who has described realities that we need to take very seriously. We have Leo Strauss, the famous 20th century political thinker, referring to Machiavelli as a teacher of evil. And it's one of the great Machiavelli questions. A new political morality, political amorality, political immorality being justified. What is it? I don't want to give you an answer. I want to give you, of course, the notion of what Machiavelli says so that you can think about this and explore this and relate it to other things, and you give the answer. That's what's important. Not a determined end in the course, but the opportunity to empower everybody to think a little bit differently, to wonder whether the categories, the boxes that we create, are the only possible boxes or are the best boxes in which to put things. And so I think when we hear a phrase like well-used cruelty, it reminds us that Machiavelli is, to use a phrase that we used perhaps too much in 21st century, thinking outside the box. Or we might say a new paradigm of political thought and political behavior. But notice what Machiavelli says, that Agathocles, he's an example of somebody who used cruelty well, did it early, did it all at once, and got on with things. And he says both people and God will forgive that kind of cruelty. And again, we have to ask, what did it lead to? What did it permit or make more likely to happen? That Syracuse, where Agathocles was, is a more stable, a more ordered, a more secure place? And if that is so, isn't that cruelty well used, Machiavelli asks? Or do we simply say, cruelty is always unjust, it leads to bad consequences? That's certainly what Cicero would say. And therefore, once we hear cruelty, we already know where to classify this guy. Bad guy. Tyrant. Whatever label we want to put on him. And so Machiavelli really is challenging. He was challenging in his own time. He was challenging, of course, to the ideas of Cicero and Aristotle, also challenging traditional Christian morality. Challenging what's being passed down as the Word of God through interpretations of Scripture, through ways that people read what Jesus said and tried to find the political implications. Jesus didn't talk very openly and directly about politics, but Jesus certainly gave moral lessons that many people believe are meant to apply in the macrocosm as well as the microcosm of the individual person. And Machiavelli is challenging all that. And one of the ways he's challenging it says is if what you're trying to achieve is a certain vision of a society and you aren't there yet, the question is how do you get there? And what's legit to get there? These are, I think, Machiavelli, at least we ought to take this away from it, these are perhaps tougher questions than we might have thought. We need to look from a variety of perspectives. We may decide Machiavelli, as Leo Strauss did, there's nobody smarter than Leo Strauss in a lot of ways, is just simply a teacher of evil. Or we might decide something very differently. But a passage like the one I read you, I think, is one that does indeed stimulate us to think and ask whether our boxes, our labels, our paradigms are the only ones there can be. Next, Machiavelli turns to what he calls civil principalities. These are principalities obtained through the consent of citizens, not through some violent intervention. But, for example, sometimes when a city-state is in trouble, it will bring in a prince to rule. It happened very briefly in Florence. The Florentines figured out they made a mistake and kicked him out. That was back in the 14th century when the Duke of Athens was brought in. Milan and other cities did that, and those folks stayed and even sometimes established dynasties. So the question is, let's look at principalities that begin with people bringing in somebody from the outside. Now, first of all, Machiavelli says, again, notice how he's sort of doing this wonderful structure of political possibilities. It can be done in two ways. One is you can be brought in by the people, by a kind of popular movement, or you can be brought in by the nobility. He says it is more difficult to succeed if you're brought in by the nobility because, and I've mentioned this before about nobility think you're their equal and they're your equal. And therefore they might bring you in, but they don't like being dominated by you. They don't like following your rules. They sort of bring you in thinking of themselves as equals and thinking of themselves as trying to have as much autonomy as possible. Then, of course, we can draw the conclusion that it is easier to succeed if you are brought in by common people. And here Machiavelli makes a very interesting distinction. He says that nobles, hereditary nobility, people with titles, people sometimes who have legal privileges in society, nobles want to oppress other people, but the people only want not to be oppressed. It's a very interesting distinction. If you're trying to satisfy a nobility, you are trying to satisfy people who want to oppress others, who want to maintain their legal or economic or political advantages. And it's hard to do. If you're trying to order a state, it's hard to do that. But people want not to be oppressed. People sort of want to be left alone. They want to be allowed to live their lives with as little intervention by the government. As, whether that's taxation or whether that's rules they have to play by or military service they're obligated to have or whatever. And so the people are easier to keep happy. Furthermore, he says, there's another advantage of the people that we don't want to forget, and that is there's simply so many of them. Nobles are a very small group. And nobles, even a few of them, can turn against you with your destruction coming next. But a few people turning against you, and you can't please all people all the time, as we know, a few people turning against you will not ultimately lead to your downfall. And so their very number makes them a safer group to support you. Then Machiavelli makes another important point, and that is, how do you win over the people? His answer is a tough one for us. There is no formula. There is no fixed way. What you have to do is look at the circumstances. History can provide examples, and from those examples, we might be able to derive principles. But one of the principles is you've got to be flexible and go with the situation. It may be possible in some societies to satisfy people with, well, what we call in Roman times, bread and circuses. In other times, it might be that those particular ways of keeping the people happy won't work. And so any ruler who wants to be successful in winning over the people needs to figure out what the people want so that they can be won over. And again, I think what Machiavelli is saying is you can't look it up in a book. You need to study history. You really need to study history hard and seriously. He emphasizes this over and over again. Remember, the work we're going to look at next is a systematic study of early Roman history as recorded by Livy. Studying the past is an awfully good guide, but one of the things you do is not find one-to-one correspondences. Here's some guy back in the past, and what he did was try to win over the people, and he did X, and look at that, he won over the people. Therefore, I'll do X. Wrong lesson. Wrong lesson. Maybe X will work, but X won't work in your situation because it worked in his. You've got to be really sure there is a parallel situation. It may take something radically different than what X did to succeed in your situation. And so sometimes when people think about the study of history, or people who are, as Machiavelli does, constantly bombard us with historical examples, that what we're supposed to do is draw up this treasure trove of things to look up. This is the way I always think about it. When I was a kid, the one thing I really wanted more than anything in the world was the Junior Woodchuck's Guidebook. For those of you who were Huey, Louie, and Dewey fans, as I was, whatever situation, I mean, the Duck Boys would be in the weirdest, oddest situations, and somebody would say, pull out your Junior Woodchuck's Guidebook and look it up, and there'd be an answer of how to deal with that particular problem. And I always thought, God, I want that book. Must be a very thick book. I want that book. What Machiavelli says is, there is no Junior Woodchuck's Guidebook. There is no treasure trove of examples where you simply say, I'm going to look up one that sort of is like the situation I'm in, and I'm going to do exactly what they did back then because I can assume the result will be the same. It doesn't work that way. That one always needs to be very alert to the present and the past. That's the best guide. And notice that all through Machiavelli's The Prince, that's exactly what he does. He gives us examples from the distant past. After all, we live a lot closer to Machiavelli's time than Machiavelli did to ancient Greece or Rome. He goes way back and looks at the past, and then he also gives us a number of examples from the present. Again, going back to the first one I used in this lecture, people who got their territories through wickedness. Okay? Agathocles, 1,800 years ago, and Oliverotto of Fermo a few years ago. And we need to be aware of both and recognize changes and differences. Now, the next question Machiavelli asked is, how do we measure a prince's power? How do we know who's doing well? How do we know who is successful in ruling? Any of you who've read resumes know that all resumes look good. Here's a particularly important answer for Machiavelli. A prince who is successful is a prince who can stand on his own rather than needing the protection of others. That's a pretty interesting definition. Can stand on his own, meaning has an army, has people administering the various branches of the government, the justice system, whatever it might be. That a prince who does not rely on others to keep him in power. Again, that was the great secret of Cesare Borgia. Other troops, the troops of the French, put Cesare Borgia into power. Then what does Cesare do? He gets rid of them and organizes his own troops. There is a prince who really does have power because men loyal to him are the ones who are in the field, and so on. Now, Machiavelli is interested not just in governance, but he's also interested to some extent, and we'll see this more in the discourses, in what we might call the technology of war. And it's very interesting because here his examples of well-governed civil principalities come not from Italy and not from the ancient world, they come from Germany. Remember, Machiavelli traveled to Germany. I've already mentioned something he did when he was in France dealing with the French monarchy. Here's something he learned while he was in Germany. He says the best example of what I'm talking about are various independent cities of Germany. Remember, Germany is not a country at this time any more than Italy is a country at this time. Germany is a big mishmash of church-ordered states and princes and kind of independent cities and all sorts of different arrangements. But he went to some of these independent cities of Germany. Here's what they've got. They've got walls, they've got moats, and they've got artillery. Of course, not too long after this, artillery won't be as useful. Machiavelli doesn't know that. He said, but more than that, they have provisions for a year, including all the raw materials that citizens will need to continue their employment. Not just food. You got to have more than food inside your city walls, or more than water, although you need those things. You need also not to have, if your city is under siege, everybody unemployed. People need to have the raw materials to make what they make, whether it's purses or cloth or something made out of iron or whatever it is. And he said, when you see a city that's been organized that way, you know that that city really can function on its own. It's not dependent on anybody else, because if it's ready for a year, sieges don't last more than a year normally. There is a place that really is secure and independent. There is a place where whoever rules that city really has something, really has power, really has things under control. Again, I want you to notice how broad Machiavelli's look is. He looks at the Italy around him that he knows very well. He looks at classical antiquity, which he knows very well. He looks at France because he was there. He looks at Germany and things he learned there. This is a man, you sort of get the picture that, every night, no matter what he was doing, he'd go back and, take some notes. What I learned today. He seems to have had, in a sense, a kind of one-track mind. I'm really interested in politics and how governments work and how power is achieved and how power is maintained and how power is extended. And he's always looking for something that will enlighten him, always looking for an example, always looking to build up that treasure trove of information, not so he can duplicate it, but so he can enunciate principles. Again, Aristotle did that, collected all this information. But the difference is Aristotle's goal was to figure out how states ought to be, ideally. Machiavelli's was how things work. How things work, what really works and what really doesn't. And so this is a very interesting notion. Now, Machiavelli finally gets to the end of his catalog. And he talks about ecclesiastical principalities. And although that might be a little city-state in Germany that was run by a local bishop, there were a lot of those, primarily, of course, he's thinking of the papacy. He says these are the most fortunate of institutions. Their rulers are really the ones who are best off because they're easy to maintain, because they're rooted in religious institutions and claim the authority, obviously we're talking about a Christian world now, of Scripture. And, it's one thing to rebel against a bad prince. It's another thing to rebel against God's representative if you take God seriously. And after all, the papacy was an office that was seen as the successor of Peter and the vicar of Christ. And even if the guy's sort of a bum, he's still the successor of Peter and the vicar of Christ. And you're going to challenge that very, very seriously. You're going to think about it before you say, I'm going to take on God's representative on earth. Now, Machiavelli points out that, therefore, the papacy has certain advantages over other kinds of principalities, even hereditary ones. I mean, this is even better than a hereditary principality in a lot of ways. And how, therefore, was the papacy kept in check in Italy? Well, the answer is, in 1454, Machiavelli says, Cosimo de' Medici and others worked out this deal. I referred to it in my narrative of history, called the Peace of Lodi, or Lodi, in which a kind of balance of power was achieved between the five main players in Italy: Venice, Milan, Florence, the papacy, and the kingdom in the south. Now, what happened? The French invaded in 1494. Remember, I've told you the French changed everything? The French invaded in 1494, and that messed up this balance of power. That said, all bets are off. It lasted 50 years. Well, 40 years. Who cares about a decade now and then? Just kidding. It lasted from 1454 to 1494, and then the French invasion messed all of that up, and it allowed the papacy to start saber-rattling again. It allowed papal expansion. And Alexander VI, the father of Cesare Borgia, and Julius II, for all practical purposes, his successor, were both men who were intent in expanding the papal states. And that was bad for Italy. So ecclesiastical states have an advantage. In the second half of the 15th century, that advantage was mitigated by the wisdom of people like Cosimo de' Medici and the kind of peace that was set up in Italy. But when that was broken, it allowed, again, for aggressive popes, because of their intrinsic advantages, to become aggressive again, and that's further messed up Italy. So the French just don't mess up Italy because they're in Italy. They also mess up Italy because they ruin that balance of power. And they allow the papacy, once again to do things that are damaging to Italy in general. Now, having said that, let's not forget that at the time Machiavelli writes this book, the Pope is Leo X, a member of the Medici family. And therefore, Machiavelli notes that he thinks that the papacy will become a more positive institution, if you will, in Italy, that it will work toward making things better than it has under the two predecessors, making things worse, with Leo X there because of Leo's goodness. So there is perhaps a touch of optimism, perhaps a touch of flattery in what Machiavelli says, in what essentially is the end of this catalog of the kinds of governments. Republics, not going to discuss them. Principalities, okay, we have what kind of principalities? Those are hereditary, not going to discuss them much. Those won by fortune, those won by ugliness and violence, those won by people being invited in, those that are ecclesiastical. Our catalog now is essentially complete, and we turn to some other issues. Issue number one that Machiavelli turns to, once this catalog is finished, is what makes the best armies. Because, he says, states need good laws, and where there are good armies, there are good laws. This goes back again to the difference between an armed and an unarmed prophet. That if you're going to have good laws and good laws that are effective, and by the way, army here doesn't just mean fighting a foreign foe. Because we need to remember armies did what we would call a lot of the police work of the time. There were no police forces. There were no, as there are in modern Italy, carabinieri or whatever. Army means men at arms. And of course, men at arms might patrol your own roads for burglars, as well as be part of an army attacking a foreign nation or defending itself against a foreign nation. So you need good arms because you really are not going to have good laws without them. And if you have good laws and no arms, that ain't going to work either. So what kind of an army can you have? Once again, Machiavelli is being systematic. There are three kinds of armies. Okay? You can have your own army. You can have an army that's bought for you, that is to say mercenaries. Or you can have an army that's sort of lent to you, which he calls auxiliaries. You can have your own army, a mercenary army, or an auxiliary army. An example, the third, by the way, would be the French troops that were sort of lent to Cesare Borgia through the machinations of his father in order for Cesare to conquer the Romagna. Now, he says, let's start by discussing mercenaries. They are worthless. They are worthless. In wartime, he says, the enemy plunders your territory because very often these mercenaries really aren't the best fighters. After all, they're fighting on contract. They're not fighting for something they love. They're not fighting for patria, for country. They're fighting for paycheck. And so, in wartime, your enemy plunders your territory, and in peacetime, your own soldiers plunder your territory because they are foreigners by definition, and when they're unemployed, or if the paycheck's late, they get rowdy. And by the way, there are many, many examples in Italian history to indeed justify what Machiavelli has to say. He says, good captains of the mercenary forces are untrustworthy, and bad ones are even worse. There is no such thing as a good mercenary army. There is no such thing as a good mercenary commander. They're all on the take. They go to the highest bidder. They aren't as courageous in the defense of your country because it isn't their country. And so Machiavelli gives some examples. Again, ancient and modern. Carthage and Milan in modern times were taken over by their mercenaries. Florence, he said, has actually been lucky. Florence has depended on mercenaries for centuries, and they've only been mildly disastrous. They haven't been totally disastrous as they have been in other places. For example, Venice. Venice, he said, won battles as long as they had their own troops. When they joined the sort of Italian system of mercenaries, that's when they began to lose. And so mercenaries are the worst kind of army. They have, in fact, more than any other single factor, perhaps, led Italy into servitude. How could the French march in and be so successful so quickly? And how could that encourage other foreign troops to come in? The answer? Well, here are the first three answers. Mercenaries, mercenaries, and yes, you got it, mercenaries.